What if the very person who destroyed your dreams became the one you were forced to call husband? In a remote Indian village, where shadows of tradition loom large and silence carries the weight of unspoken suffering, unfolds a tale that will challenge everything you believe about justice and revenge. Before we venture into this haunting story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Join our community of true crime enthusiasts as we explore cases that reveal the darkest aspects of human nature and the price of survival. Welcome to True Crime Stories Archive, your gateway to the chilling world of real-life horror. Here, we delve into the darkest corners of humanity, unearthing terrifying stories that expose the depths of human suffering and survival. Miles from the nearest city, nestled among rolling fields and dusty paths, lived 16-year-old Shahana. Unlike many girls in her village, she dared to dream beyond the boundaries set before her. Her quick mind and gentle spirit set her apart, earning admiration from teachers who saw in her the potential for a different life, one filled with education, opportunity, and the chance to break free from the cycle of poverty that had defined her family for generations. In the humble home she shared with her parents, Shahana would sit by a flickering lamp each night, poring over borrowed textbooks. Her father, Harish, spent his days breaking stones under the merciless sun, his calloused hands telling stories of endless labor. Her mother, Priya, moved from house to house, washing clothes and sweeping floors, her back bent with the weight of their circumstances. Together, they earned just enough to keep hunger at bay, but dreams of education seemed as distant as the stars that watched over their village. Against this backdrop of quiet struggle emerged Nand Kishore, a 62-year-old village elder whose influence cast long shadows across the community. Decades of settling disputes and offering strategic financial help had earned him a position of unquestioned authority. His word was law, his judgment final, his presence both revered and feared. Yet behind the mask of respectability lurked something far more sinister, a darkness that would soon engulf Shahana's life. At first, his attention seemed benign. He would stop by their modest home, engaging Harish in conversations about village matters, offering suggestions about their financial troubles. Small gifts would appear, a bag of rice here, a few coins there, gestures that seemed born of kindness but carried hidden costs. His eyes would linger on Shahana during these visits, watching her movements with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. When she confided her discomfort to her mother, Priya dismissed it as imagination, perhaps even a sign of respect from a community elder. After all, in their world, questioning such authority was unthinkable. The weight of tradition, coupled with their desperate circumstances, created a perfect storm of vulnerability that Nand Kishore knew exactly how to exploit. As weeks turned to months, his visits grew more frequent, his presence more oppressive. He would speak of Shahana's future as if it were his to determine, praising her beauty and intelligence in ways that made her skin crawl. The walls of their small home seemed to shrink with each visit, the air growing thicker with unspoken threats and expectations. Then came the afternoon that would forever alter the course of Shahana's life. On a day when her parents were working and her siblings visiting relatives, Nand Kishore appeared at their door. The sun hung high in the sky, casting dancing shadows through their modest windows, as Shahana found herself alone with the men whose reputation had been built on decades of carefully cultivated power. The weight of that afternoon pressed down on Shahana like a physical force. She greeted him as custom demanded, her voice barely a whisper, but the elder's presence filled their modest home with an oppressive energy that made breathing difficult. His questions, at first mundane, took on an increasingly personal tone that made her heart race with growing terror. When she tried to excuse herself, his massive frame blocked the doorway, trapping her in a nightmare she had sensed coming but had been powerless to prevent. The transformation in his demeanor was instant, the respected village elder disappeared, replaced by a predator whose true nature had been hidden behind years of calculated benevolence. His hands, rough from decades of wielding power over the vulnerable, reached for her with entitled determination. In those horrifying moments, Shahana's world contracted to a single point of terror. Her protests went unheard, her struggles ignored, as Nand Kishore took what he believed was his right. The afternoon light that had once danced so innocently through their windows now seemed to mock her helplessness, casting strange shadows across the floor where her innocence lay shattered. The aftermath of that violation left Shahana in a state of suspended animation. She moved through the following days like a ghost, her mind struggling to process the trauma while her body carried the evidence of what had been done to her. The village's suffocating silence became her constant companion, wrapping around her like a shroud as she tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But normalcy proved impossible when her body began to show signs of pregnancy. The whispers started slowly at first, then grew into a crescendo of judgment and speculation that rippled through the village like poison. The news of her condition spread rapidly, forcing the community to confront an uncomfortable truth about the men they had elevated to such heights of respect. The initial outrage that swept through the village seemed promising. Villagers spoke in hushed, angry tones about the violation of trust, about the abuse of power. Nand Kishore was arrested, his authority temporarily stripped away as the legal system grudgingly acknowledged the gravity of his crime. Yet the elders' influence ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. The same system that had promised justice began to bend under the weight of his connections and the entrenched beliefs about tradition and authority. His release from custody sent shockwaves through the community, but few dared to speak against it openly. The power he had cultivated over decades proved stronger than any moral considerations. It was then that Shahana's parents, trapped between poverty and social pressure, made a decision that would haunt them forever. Encouraged by community elders and driven by desperate circumstances, they agreed to marry their daughter to her rapist. The logic, twisted by years of traditional beliefs and economic hardship, suggested that marriage would protect her from social stigma and ensure financial security for her unborn child. The wedding itself was a mockery of everything sacred. 16-year-old Shahana, her pregnancy now visible, stood beside the 62-year-old man who had destroyed her dreams, while the village watched with a mixture of pity and resigned acceptance. Some turned away, unable to bear witness to this sanctioned tragedy, while others nodded in approval at what they saw as a practical solution to an uncomfortable situation. Life as Nand Kishore's wife proved to be an extension of the nightmare that had begun that fateful afternoon. He treated her not as a wife but as a possession, a trophy that validated his power over both her and the community that had allowed this to happen. Each day brought new humiliations, new demonstrations of his control over every aspect of her existence. In the quiet moments when she was alone, Shahana would remember the girl she had been, the one who dreamed of university, of books, of a life filled with possibility. That girl seemed to belong to another lifetime now, her hopes and aspirations replaced by the cold reality of her imprisonment in a marriage that was nothing more than institutionalized abuse. The birth of her first child, a daughter, brought Shahana a momentary flicker of joy in her darkened world. The infant's innocent face became her sole source of comfort, a reminder that even in the depths of despair, life could create something pure. But Nand Kishore's reaction to the birth shattered even this small solace. He viewed the child with open disdain, seeing a daughter as worthless, another burden he was forced to bear. His neglect of both mother and child was absolute. Shahana found herself struggling to provide for her daughter's basic needs, often going hungry herself to ensure the infant had enough to eat. The village, which had once whispered about her tragedy, now turned a blind eye to their daily suffering, accepting it as the natural order of things. When she became pregnant again, barely recovered from her first childbirth, Shahana felt the last fragments of her hope crumbling. The physical toll of pregnancy combined with constant emotional abuse began to wear away at her youth, leaving her aged beyond her years. Yet beneath this deteriorating exterior, something else was taking root, a quiet, burning rage that grew stronger with each passing day. In the solitude of her thoughts, Shahana began to change. The fear that had once paralyzed her slowly transformed into a cold, calculating anger. She watched Nand Kishore with new eyes, noting his routines, his habits, the predictable patterns of his days. Her silence, once born of terror, became a mask behind which she planned and waited. Her small acts of defiance began subtly. She would take slightly longer to respond to his commands, meet his gaze with an unwavering stare that made him uncomfortable, move through the house with a deliberate slowness that challenged his authority. These tiny rebellions were a way of reclaiming fragments of her identity, pieces of herself that had been stripped away. Each night, after ensuring her children were asleep, Shahana would stand at the window of their modest home, staring into the darkness. The same stars that had once witnessed her dreams of education now bore silent testimony to her transformation. The cheerful, ambitious girl who had once dreamed of university books was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned that survival sometimes required terrible choices. The village's nighttime silence became her confidant, the darkness her counsel. In these quiet hours, she would replay every moment of suffering, every humiliation, every stolen dream. The weight of these memories, rather than crushing her spirit, hardened her resolve. She began to understand that her life would never change unless she forced that change herself. Her children's future became both her motivation and her torment. She saw in their eyes the same spark of hope she had once possessed, and the thought of them growing up in this atmosphere of fear and submission became unbearable. Her daughter, especially, showed signs of the same quick intelligence that had once marked Shahana's own childhood. The idea of watching history repeat itself, of seeing another generation of dreams shattered by tradition and male authority, fed the fire of her determination. As months turned into years, Shahana's planning became more focused. She studied the kitchen knives with new interest, testing their weight when no one was watching. She learned which floorboards creaked and which remained silent under pressure. She memorized the sound of Nand Kishore's breathing when he slept, the way his body lay vulnerable in the depths of night. The transformation in her was so gradual that even Nand Kishore failed to notice. To him, she remained the submissive wife he had forced into existence. He never saw how her eyes followed his movements with predatory attention, never recognized that her quietness had evolved from fear to purpose. His arrogance, the same quality that had allowed him to destroy her youth with impunity, now blinded him to the danger growing within his own home. The night Shahana chose for her vengeance arrived with an unusual stillness. The air hung heavy with unspoken intentions as she moved through her evening routine with mechanical precision. She prepared dinner as always, served Nand Kishore with the same quiet submission he had come to expect, and put her children to bed with extra tenderness, knowing that tomorrow their world would change forever. Each minute seemed to stretch into eternity as she waited for the household to settle into its nighttime rhythm. The soft breathing of her children in their room provided a gentle counterpoint to the thundering of her heart. She had chosen this night carefully, a time when the moon was waning, casting just enough light to see but leaving plenty of shadows in which to move. In the kitchen, the knife she had selected weeks ago waited. She had kept it deliberately sharper than the others, testing its edge when alone, preparing it for this singular purpose. Its weight in her hand felt familiar now, almost comforting, like an extension of her will. The metal caught a glint of moonlight as she lifted it, a brief flash that seemed to mirror the cold determination in her eyes. Nand Kishore's room lay at the end of a short hallway. How many times had she walked this path in fear? Tonight, she moved with a different energy, each step deliberate, calculated, silent. The floorboards that usually creaked remained quiet under her careful tread, as if the house itself was conspiring with her purpose. Through the partially open door, she could see his form on the bed. Even in sleep, he maintained an air of authority, sprawled across the mattress as if claiming ownership of every inch of space. The sight of him lying there, unaware and vulnerable, sparked a surge of emotions in Shahana, hatred, disgust, and underneath it all, a fierce joy at knowing his power over her was about to end. She approached the bed like a shadow, her movements fluid and precise. Years of serving him, of anticipating his needs and movements, had taught her exactly how he slept, which side he favored, where he was most vulnerable. The moonlight filtering through the window cast strange patterns across his face, highlighting the features that had haunted her nightmares for so long. In that moment, standing over him, Shahana felt a strange sense of clarity. All the fear, all the uncertainty that had plagued her life since that first afternoon of violation, seemed to evaporate. She was no longer the helpless girl he had trapped, no longer the silent wife he had created. She had transformed into something else entirely, an instrument of justice, a force of retribution. The first strike was precisely aimed, delivered with all the force of her accumulated rage. Nand Kishore's eyes flew open in shock, registering first confusion, then recognition, and finally fear, an emotion Shahana had never seen on his face before. His attempt to cry out was cut short by her second blow, then her third. Each strike was methodical, purposeful, releasing years of suppressed anguish. Blood spread across the sheets, dark and accusing in the moonlight. Shahana continued her assault with mechanical efficiency, her face set in a mask of concentration. This wasn't the frenzied attack of a desperate woman, it was the calculated execution of a plan years in the making. She watched the life drain from his eyes, observed as the men who had wielded such power over her became nothing more than flesh and bone. When it was done, she stood motionless, the knife still clutched in her hand. The room had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by her steady breathing. She felt no triumph, no immediate sense of victory, only a profound emptiness, as if something fundamental had shifted in the universe. The weight of her action settled around her like a heavy cloak, but there was no regret, no hesitation about what she had done. As dawn approached, Shahana methodically cleaned herself, her movements precise and unhurried. The night's darkness began to lift, revealing the first hints of morning through the windows. She knew discovery was inevitable. In a village where secrets rarely remained hidden, the death of someone as prominent as Nand Kishore would send shockwaves through the community. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the first signs of the village awakening drifted through the walls. The usual morning sounds, women drawing water from wells, cattle being led to pasture, children's distant voices, created an surreal backdrop to the scene inside the house. It was a young boy, sent to summon Nandkishore for an early morning council meeting, who first discovered what had happened. His screams shattered the morning peace, drawing villagers like moths to flame. They came running, their curiosity quickly turning to horror as the news spread. The crowd that gathered outside the house grew larger with each passing minute, their whispers building into a chorus of shock and disbelief. The mighty Nandkishore, whose authority had seemed unshakable, lay dead in his own bed. The arrival of police brought a new energy to the scene. They moved through the house with professional detachment, documenting every detail, photographing the evidence of violence that Shahana had left behind. She sat quietly in a corner, her children clutching at her skirts, watching as strangers invaded the space where she had finally reclaimed her power. The investigation revealed a story that many had suspected but few had dared to voice. As police pieced together the history of abuse, forced marriage, and years of suffering, the village found itself divided. Some elderly women, who had spent their lives accepting similar fates, looked at Shahana with a mixture of fear and secret admiration. Younger girls watched her with wide eyes, seeing in her actions a terrible kind of liberation. Men of the village, particularly those who had benefited from Nandkishore's influence, reacted with outrage. They spoke of tradition, of respect, of the natural order that Shahana had violated. Their angry voices carried undertones of fear that other women might follow her example, that the carefully maintained structure of their society might begin to crumble. During her interrogation, Shahana spoke with a clarity that unsettled the investigators. She described every detail of her life under Nandkishore's control, the initial rape, the forced marriage, the years of abuse, without emotion. When asked about the night of the murder, she recounted her actions with the same steady voice, as if describing something she had watched rather than performed. Her parents, when called to testify, were broken figures. Harish and Priya stood before the authorities, their faces lined with guilt and grief. They spoke of their poverty, their desperation, the impossible choice they had been forced to make. Their words painted a picture of a society where the poorest families were often left with no good options, where choosing between different forms of suffering became a way of life. The legal proceedings that followed became a focal point for broader discussions about women's rights, poverty, and the dark side of traditional authority. Lawyers argued passionately about justified homicide, about the limits of human endurance, about what constitutes self-defense in a situation of prolonged abuse. Activists seized upon Shahana's story, holding it up as an example of both systemic failure and female empowerment. The courthouse, a modest building that had seen countless minor disputes, now hosted a case that would challenge its very foundations. As Shahana's trial progressed, each day brought new revelations that forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about their collective silence and complicity. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of prolonged abuse, explaining how years of trauma could lead to calculated violence. They spoke of learned helplessness transformed into desperate action, of how traditional systems of justice had failed women like Shahana, leaving them with no recourse except to take matters into their own hands. The prosecution painted a different picture, arguing that regardless of her suffering, the premeditated nature of the killing demanded severe punishment. They emphasized the brutality of the act, the multiple stab wounds, the careful planning, all evidence, they claimed, of a cold-blooded murder rather than an impulsive act of self-defense. Throughout the proceedings, Shahana sat unmoved, her face a mask of composure that unnerved even the most seasoned courtroom observers. When called to testify, she spoke with unnerving directness about the years leading up to that fatal night. Her voice never wavered as she described the systematic destruction of her dreams, the daily humiliations, the slow death of her spirit under Nandkishore's authority. "I died long before I killed him," she told the court, her words echoing through the stunned silence. "He took my life the day he forced himself on me. The day my parents agreed to give me to him. The day society decided his reputation was worth more than my future. I simply returned the favor." Outside the courthouse, the village had become a battleground of opposing viewpoints. Young women began speaking out about their own experiences of harassment and abuse, emboldened by Shahana's actions. Older women, who had spent decades accepting their fate, found themselves questioning long-held beliefs about submission and duty. The men of the village grew increasingly uncomfortable as their wives and daughters began asking questions that had never been voiced before. Why did tradition always favor male authority? Why were girls expected to sacrifice their dreams for family honor? The comfortable certainties of their world were being challenged, and many responded with anger and defensiveness. Meanwhile, Shahana's children became the subject of intense debate. What would become of them? How would they process their mother's actions? The daughter, showing the same sharp intelligence as her mother, watched the proceedings with an unsettling understanding in her young eyes. Despite her age, she seemed to grasp the magnitude of what her mother had done, and why. Social workers who interviewed the children reported something unexpected. Rather than being traumatized by their father's death, they appeared relieved. The atmosphere of fear that had permeated their home had lifted, replaced by a strange kind of peace. Their mother, though facing serious charges, showed more genuine warmth and engagement with them than she had in years. As the trial neared its conclusion, the judge found himself facing a profound dilemma. The facts of the case were clear: Shahana had committed a premeditated killing. Yet the circumstances that led to that act represented a failure of every system meant to protect vulnerable members of society. How could justice be served while acknowledging these complexities? The day of the verdict arrived with a weight that seemed to press down on the entire village. The courtroom was packed, with people spilling out into the corridors, all waiting to hear how justice would interpret this complex intersection of trauma, revenge, and social responsibility. The judge, a veteran of countless cases, took unusual care in delivering his verdict. He began by acknowledging the broader implications of the case, speaking directly to the societal issues it had exposed. His words carried an understanding of both the letter of the law and the human tragedy that had unfolded. In the case before us, he began, we are not merely judging an act of violence, but examining the circumstances that can drive a human being to such desperate measures. The evidence presents us with a systematic failure of community, tradition, and justice itself. The sentence was carefully crafted, 15 years in prison, with the possibility of early release based on good behavior. The judge explained that while the law could not condone premeditated killing, it must acknowledge the extreme circumstances that had led to it. The sentence was meant to balance punishment with understanding, justice with compassion. As the verdict was read, Shahana remained stoic, her expression unchanging. But those closest to her noticed a subtle shift in her posture, not defeat, but something closer to acceptance. The prison term she faced seemed almost insignificant compared to the years of imprisonment she had already endured in her marriage. Before being led away, she was granted a moment with her children. The exchange was brief but profound. She held them close, whispering words of love and encouragement. To her daughter, she spoke of education, of the importance of maintaining her dreams despite the obstacles she might face. To her son, she spoke of respect, of breaking the cycle of violence that had marked their family's history. The aftermath of the verdict rippled through the community in unexpected ways. The village elders, who had initially condemned Shahana's actions without reservation, found themselves forced to examine their own roles in perpetuating a system that had led to such tragedy. Several families quietly withdrew their daughters from arranged marriages, citing concerns about compatibility and consent. Local authorities, spurred by the publicity surrounding the case, began implementing programs to address domestic violence and women's rights. A shelter for abused women opened in a nearby town, funded partly by urban activists who had followed Shahana's story. Young girls in the village started attending school in greater numbers, their parents perhaps understanding for the first time the true cost of denying education to their daughters. Shahana's parents, carrying the weight of their choices, became advocates for change in their own way. Harish, in particular, spoke openly about the mistake of prioritizing traditional values over their daughters' well-being. Their public remorse encouraged other families to reconsider their approaches to their daughters' futures. The years following Shahana's imprisonment brought unexpected transformations to the village. Her story, far from fading into memory, became a catalyst for profound social change. Women who had never dared to question their circumstances began finding their voices, first in whispers, then in increasingly confident declarations. The local school saw a surge in female enrollment. Parents who might once have prioritized their sons' education now encouraged their daughters to pursue learning with equal vigor. The old schoolteacher who had recognized Shahana's potential years ago became an unofficial counselor, helping young girls navigate the delicate balance between tradition and personal ambition. Shahana's children, under the care of her parents, grew up carrying both the burden and the legacy of their mother's actions. Her daughter, displaying the same academic brilliance that had once marked Shahana's youth, earned a scholarship to study in the city. She became living proof of what her mother had sacrificed everything to protect: the right to dream, to learn, to choose one's own path. Inside the prison walls, Shahana underwent her own transformation. She taught herself to read and write in English, helping other inmates do the same. Her quiet strength and resilience earned her the respect of both inmates and guards. She began documenting her experiences, filling notebooks with reflections on power, justice, and the price of freedom. Letters from the village brought news of changing attitudes. The system of informal loans that had once given men like Nand Kishore such power over poor families was being replaced by women's self-help groups and microfinance initiatives. Young women were finding ways to support their families without sacrificing their dignity or dreams. The case became a reference point in legal circles, cited in discussions about domestic violence, forced marriage, and the limits of self-defense. Law students studied it as an example of how traditional justice systems often fail society's most vulnerable members. Social workers used it to illustrate the importance of early intervention in cases of abuse. Perhaps most significantly, the village's younger generation grew up with a different understanding of power and gender relations. Boys were taught about respect and consent from an early age. Girls learned that their value extended beyond marriage and motherhood. The silence that had protected abusers for generations was gradually being replaced by open dialogue and accountability. 10 years into her sentence, Shahana received news that would have seemed impossible in her youth. The village council, now including several women members, had established a scholarship fund in her name. The fund specifically targeted girls from impoverished families, ensuring they would have educational opportunities regardless of their economic circumstances. Visitors to the prison reported finding Shahana at peace with her choices. She spoke often of her children, taking pride in their achievements while carrying the sorrow of missing their daily lives. When asked if she regretted her actions, her response was always the same: "I regret that it was necessary, but I do not regret protecting my children from the fate I endured." As Shahana's release date approached, the village found itself grappling with mixed emotions. The woman who would return was not the same one who had left. Prison had not broken her spirit; instead, it had refined her purpose. Through letters and occasional visits, she had become a symbol of both warning and hope, a reminder of the devastating consequences of oppression and the possibility of transformation. During her final year of imprisonment, Shahana began receiving letters from unexpected sources. Women from across the country wrote to share their stories of survival, of escaping abuse, of finding strength in her example. Some had left abusive marriages, others had returned to school, and many had found the courage to speak out against injustice in their own communities. The prison authorities noted her exemplary behavior and her positive influence on other inmates. She had established a basic literacy program, helping women who had never held a pen to write their own names. Her quiet dignity and unwavering focus on education earned her early release after serving 12 years of her 15-year sentence. The day of her release dawned bright and clear. Her children, now young adults, waited outside the prison gates. Her daughter, completing her final year of medical school, stood tall and proud. Her son, who had grown into a thoughtful young man studying law, carried himself with a gentle strength that defied the violent legacy of his father. Shahana emerged from the gates with measured steps, her face showing lines of experience but her eyes bright with unchanged determination. The reunion with her children was quiet, intense, filled with tears and whispered words of love. They held each other, three survivors who had each carried their own burdens, finally reunited under the open sky. The village had prepared for her return with a mixture of apprehension and respect. Many of the old guard who had once condemned her were gone, replaced by a younger generation that viewed her story through different eyes. The small house where she had once lived in fear had been transformed into a women's community center, a place where girls could study, women could meet, and survivors could find support. Her parents, now elderly but still active in community affairs, had prepared a small home for her near the school. Priya, her mother, had aged considerably, the weight of past decisions evident in her worn face. But there was pride there too, pride in her daughter's strength, in her grandchildren's achievements, in the changes their family's tragedy had helped bring about. Shahana's first weeks of freedom were spent quietly, reacquainting herself with a village that had changed almost as much as she had. Young girls would stop by to seek her advice about education or careers. Women would come to share their struggles, finding in her a compassionate listener who understood their fears and hopes. The school teacher who had once seen such promise in her young student invited her to speak to the classes. Standing before a room full of bright-eyed girls in uniforms, Shahana found her voice shaking as she urged them to hold on to their dreams, to support each other, to never accept that their lives were worth less than anyone else's. Shahana's reintegration into village life became a testament to resilience and redemption. She converted part of her new home into a small library, filling it with books she had dreamed of reading in her youth. Local children would gather there in the evenings, sitting cross-legged on worn rugs as she taught them English, mathematics, and most importantly, the value of their own potential. Her daughter's graduation from medical school became a celebration for the entire village. The ceremony, held in a distant city, was attended by a delegation of local girls who saw in her achievement the possibility of their own futures. When she opened a small clinic in the village, providing healthcare to women who had previously been too shy or afraid to seek medical attention, it marked another step in the community's transformation. Her son chose a different path but one equally meaningful. His law practice focused on defending women's rights and fighting against domestic violence. He worked tirelessly to create legal awareness programs in rural areas, helping women understand their rights and the protections available to them. The irony of how his father's actions had shaped his dedication to justice was not lost on anyone. As years passed, Shahana's story began appearing in textbooks and academic studies. Researchers would visit the village, documenting the changes that had taken place in the aftermath of her actions. They found a community that had undergone a remarkable evolution, where girls' education was now prioritized, where women held positions of authority in the village council, where domestic violence was no longer met with silent acceptance. The Women's Community Center, operating from her old house, became a model for other villages. It offered vocational training, legal aid, and counseling services. Women who had once been trapped in abusive marriages found refuge there, along with the support needed to rebuild their lives. The center's walls, once witnesses to Shahana's suffering, now echoed with the sounds of learning, laughter, and healing. Priya, in her final years, found peace in watching her daughter's quiet work of transformation. The guilt she had carried for decades gradually eased as she saw how their family's tragedy had sparked positive change. Before she passed away, she wrote a letter to be shared with other mothers, urging them to protect their daughters' dreams at any cost. Shahana herself aged with grace, her silver hair and lined face carrying the dignity of one who had survived the worst and emerged stronger. Young women would seek her out for advice, not just about education or careers, but about life itself, how to maintain hope in dark times, how to find strength when everything seemed lost, how to transform pain into purpose. The village that had once been known for its rigid traditions became recognized as a center of progressive change. Government officials would visit to study their initiatives for women's empowerment. Other communities sent representatives to learn how they had managed to break centuries-old cycles of oppression while maintaining the positive aspects of their cultural heritage. 20 years after Shahana's release, the village had become unrecognizable from the place where a tragedy had unfolded. The dusty paths were now paved roads, and solar-powered streetlights illuminated corners that had once harbored dark secrets. But the most profound changes weren't physical, they lived in the spirits of the people, especially the women, who walked these streets with their heads held high. Her grandchildren, growing up in this transformed environment, knew her story not just as a family tragedy but as a turning point in their community's history. Her granddaughter, showing the same intellectual spark that had marked both her grandmother and mother, often sat with Shahana in the library, asking questions about the past while dreaming of her own future in scientific research. The annual scholarship ceremony became the village's most important event. Each year, girls from impoverished families received funding for higher education through the fund established in Shahana's name. During these ceremonies, she would sit quietly in the back, watching young women step forward to claim opportunities she had once been denied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The community center expanded its services to include a technological training facility, ensuring that rural women could compete in the digital age. Programs teaching coding, digital literacy, and online entrepreneurship helped bridge the urban-rural divide, allowing women to work from their villages while maintaining their family ties. Local authorities began documenting what became known as the Shahana effect, a measurable decrease in domestic violence cases, an increase in female education rates, and a rise in women's economic independence across the region. The model of change that had emerged from their village was being studied and replicated in other rural communities facing similar challenges. On her 70th birthday, Shahana received an unexpected visit from a group of law students who had studied her case. They brought with them a bound volume of legal reforms that had been influenced by her story. Legislative changes, judicial precedents, and policy modifications that had helped strengthen women's rights across the country, all traced their origins, in part, to the events that had unfolded in her life. In her final years, Shahana spent most of her time in the library she had created. She would often be found surrounded by young girls, sharing not just knowledge from books but wisdom from her experiences. Her message remained consistent: education is not just about learning to read and write. It's about learning to recognize your own worth, to stand up for your rights, and to help others do the same. The village's transformation became a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with similar issues. Delegations would visit to understand how they had managed to challenge deeply entrenched traditions without causing their society to collapse. The answer, they discovered, lay not in violent rebellion but in the steady, persistent work of education, awareness, and community support. In her final days, Shahana documented her complete story in a memoir that would later become required reading in universities' gender studies programs. Her words, sharp and unflinching, captured not just her personal journey but the universal struggle for dignity and justice that resonated with readers worldwide. The last chapter she wrote, completed just weeks before her passing, contained a powerful message: my story is not just about revenge or justice. It's about the price we pay when society values tradition over humanity, when we allow power to corrupt absolutely, and when we meet suffering with silence. But it's also about hope, the hope that through education, through courage, and through standing together, we can create a world where no girl has to choose between her dreams and her life. Shahana passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by 3 generations of her family. The village observed 3 days of mourning, not out of tradition, but out of genuine respect for a woman who had transformed their community through her suffering, strength, and subsequent dedication to change. Her funeral drew thousands from surrounding villages and cities. Among the mourners were successful professionals who had received education through her scholarship fund, women who had escaped abuse inspired by her story, and countless young girls who had grown up seeing her as a symbol of possibility. The most powerful tribute came from her granddaughter, now a renowned scientist, who spoke at the memorial service. My grandmother's life taught us that sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't loud rebellions but quiet revolutions, the daily choice to stand up, to speak out, to teach, to learn, and to believe in a better future. The village council posthumously renamed their main educational complex, the Shahana Institute for Women's Empowerment. The facility now houses a school, a vocational training center, a legal aid clinic, and a research center dedicated to studying and promoting women's rights in rural communities. Perhaps her most enduring legacy was not in the buildings named after her or the programs she inspired, but in the fundamental shift in consciousness she had helped create. In the villages across the region, when families welcomed daughters, they no longer whispered condolences. Instead, they spoke of possibilities, of dreams, of futures filled with choice and opportunity. The final pages of her memoir, published posthumously, ended with words that would be engraved on the entrance of the institute: to every girl who dares to dream, remember, your life is not a price to be paid for someone else's power. Your dreams are not negotiable. Your worth is not measured by your silence. Stand tall, speak truth, and know that in your courage to challenge darkness, you light the way for others to follow. Today, decades after Shahana's story began in that small village, her impact continues to ripple outward. Each year, thousands of girls graduate from schools and colleges across the region, carrying with them not just degrees and diplomas, but the unshakable conviction that they deserve to write their own stories, chase their own dreams, and shape their own destinies. In the end, Shahana's legacy transcended the tragedy that had shaped it. She had transformed an act of desperate survival into a catalyst for lasting change, proving that even in the darkest of circumstances, one person's courage to stand up against injustice can illuminate the path toward a more equitable future for generations to come. Before we end this powerful story, let me speak directly to you, our valued viewers. Shahana's tale is more than just another true crime narrative. It's a mirror reflecting societies across the globe where silence still shelters abuse, where tradition still chains dreams, and where poverty still forces impossible choices. Every 5 minutes, somewhere in the world, a girl faces a similar situation. Behind closed doors, in villages and cities alike, countless Shahanas are fighting battles we never see, carrying burdens we can barely imagine. They stand at the crossroads where tradition meets human rights, where survival meets dignity, where silence meets the desperate need to scream. But remember, Shahana's story isn't just about tragedy. It's about transformation. It shows us that change is possible, even in the most entrenched systems. It proves that one person's courage can crack the foundations of centuries-old oppression. To those watching who recognize themselves in Shahana's struggle, you are not alone. Your dreams matter. Your life matters. Your voice matters. There are organizations, support systems, and communities ready to help. To those who see themselves as potential allies, speak up. When you witness injustice, don't let comfort keep you quiet. Support education initiatives for girls. Challenge discriminatory practices in your communities. Small actions create ripples that become waves of change. If this story has moved you, share it. Not for the views or likes, but because somewhere, someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know that survival is possible, that change is possible, that justice, even if delayed, is possible. Remember, Shahana's village transformed not just because of her actions, but because people finally opened their eyes to the cost of their silence. They chose to change. We can too. Before you leave, take a moment to subscribe to True Crime Stories Archive. We're committed to bringing you stories that matter, stories that challenge us to think deeper about justice, society, and our role in creating change. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of Shahana's story resonated most with you? What changes do you think we need in our own communities? Together, we can ensure that stories like Shahana's become historical lessons rather than contemporary realities. Because in the end, the greatest crime is not the act of rebellion against oppression, it's the silence that allows oppression to thrive. Thank you for watching. This is True Crime Stories Archive, reminding you that every story matters, every voice counts, and every person has the power to create change.